You just lost an opportunity that could have completely changed the direction of your career. Not because you weren't capable, not because someone stopped you, but because something inside your own mind distorted the situation in such a subtle way that you didn't even notice. You saw threat where there was invitation, interpreted constructive criticism as personal attack, rejected a chance for growth because it didn't fit perfectly into the image you have of yourself. And the most disturbing part of all this is that right now, as you read these words, you're probably doing it again. Your mind is filtering, distorting, reorganizing the reality around you so that it fits the patterns you built years, maybe decades ago. And you call this intuition, self-preservation, being authentic. But Jean Piaget, the man who dedicated more than 60 years studying how the human mind constructs reality, discovered something that will make you question every decision you've made in recent months. He discovered that most adults never really mature cognitively. They continue operating with the same rigid mental patterns they developed in childhood and adolescence, just with a more sophisticated vocabulary to justify their limitations. And these obsolete mental structures don't just limit your growth, they actively sabotage your chances of success, happiness, and fulfillment. The most disturbing discovery Piaget made wasn't about how children learn. It was about how adults stop learning and then build elaborate psychological defenses to never have to admit they stopped. And this explains why you keep repeating the same mistakes, attracting the same problems, feeling the same frustration year after year, even when you swear to yourself that this time it's going to be different. Today I'm going to show you exactly how your lack of awareness about your own mental processes is creating 7 specific patterns of self-sabotage in your life. And more importantly, I'm going to reveal the exact process that Piaget identified for you to finally recognize these patterns, dismantle them, and rebuild cognitive structures that actually serve the person you want to become. This isn't about positive thinking or empty affirmations. It's about understanding the literal architecture of your thinking and how it determines what you can or cannot see in the world around you. Piaget spent decades documenting cases of brilliant, talented, well-intentioned people who systematically destroyed their own lives because they couldn't see beyond the limitations of their own mental schemas. And he discovered that the smarter the person, the more sophisticated the rationalizations they create, to never have to question the way they think. You're about to see your own mind in a way you never imagined possible. And I warn you now, it's going to be uncomfortable because you're going to recognize patterns you've defended as personality traits, when they're actually just bugs in your mental operating system that no one ever taught you to fix. Let me tell you about a case Piaget documented in the early 1950s in Geneva. A 38-year-old man, trained engineer, above average intelligence, sought help because he couldn't maintain professional relationships for more than a few months. He had the technical skills, the training, the experience, but always ended up in intense conflicts with colleagues and superiors. During the sessions, Piaget noticed something fascinating. Every time someone presented an idea different from his, the engineer didn't see that as an alternative perspective. He interpreted it as a direct attack on his competence. When a colleague suggested a different approach to a project, he only heard "you're wrong and I'm right." When a superior asked for adjustments to the work, he processed it as "you're incompetent and don't belong in this role." It wasn't ill will. It wasn't conscious arrogance. It was the literal way his brain was structured to process information. Piaget identified that this man had never fully developed what he called cognitive decentration, the ability to step out of one's own point of view and genuinely consider that other perspectives can be valid simultaneously with your own. He was cognitively stuck in what Piaget called egocentrism, not in the moral sense of being selfish, but in the structural sense that his mind literally could only process reality through a single point of reference, his own. And here's the part that scared Piaget the most. This man was absolutely unconscious of it. He had rational and well-articulated explanations for every conflict, for every dismissal, for every destroyed relationship. The problem was always in others, never in the way he processed information. And the more Piaget studied cases like this, the more he realized this wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Most adults operate with cognitive structures they developed between 7 and 15 years of age and never critically revisited. They just got better at justifying the limitations of these structures. The first way you sabotage yourself through lack of awareness is through what Piaget called assimilation without accommodation. Your brain has mental schemas, structures that organize how you understand the world. When you encounter new information, you have two options. Assimilation, which is fitting the new information into schemas you already have, or accommodation, which is changing the schemas to incorporate the new reality. People with low awareness only do assimilation. They distort every new experience to fit what they already believe. Do you know someone who complains they never meet trustworthy people? That person probably has a mental schema that says the world is dangerous and people will disappoint you. So every time they meet someone new, they unconsciously select only the behaviors that confirm that schema and completely ignore contrary evidence. When the person is kind, they think it's manipulation. When the person establishes healthy boundaries, they interpret it as rejection. When the person makes a normal human mistake, they register it as definitive betrayal. It's not conscious paranoia. It's the cognitive structure doing exactly what it was programmed to do. Maintain internal consistency, even if that means distorting external reality. And you do this all the time without realizing it. How many times have you already decided you didn't like someone in the first 5 minutes and then spent weeks collecting evidence to justify that first impression? Piaget documented hundreds of cases where people destroyed potential friendships, business partnerships, romantic relationships, all because their mental schemas couldn't accommodate the complexity of another human being. They needed everyone to fit into simple categories, good or bad, trustworthy or dangerous, competent or incompetent. And when reality didn't cooperate with these rigid categories, they blamed reality instead of questioning their categories. The second form of self-sabotage is what Piaget identified as concrete operational thinking, in situations that require formal operational thinking. Let me break this down because it's crucial. In Piaget's stages of cognitive development, most people reach concrete operations around age 7. This means they can think logically, but only about concrete, tangible things they can see and touch. Formal operations, which should develop around age 12, is the ability to think abstractly, to consider hypotheticals, to understand systems and relationships you can't directly observe. But here's what Piaget found that shocked the academic world. A significant percentage of adults never fully develop formal operational thinking. They can handle it in their area of expertise, but in other domains of life, they regress to concrete thinking. And this creates massive self-sabotage. Think about someone who says, "I'll believe it when I see it" about everything in life. They need concrete proof before they'll invest in a relationship, before they'll take a career risk, before they'll try something new. But the biggest opportunities in life, the most meaningful relationships, the breakthrough career moves, these all require you to act on abstract potential, on patterns you recognize, on systems you understand conceptually before you can see them physically. Piaget studied entrepreneurs and found a clear pattern. The successful ones could think in formal operations about their business. They could see potential markets that didn't exist yet, could imagine products that hadn't been invented, could understand customer needs that hadn't been articulated. The ones who failed insisted on concrete evidence for everything, needed to see proof of demand before creating supply, needed guaranteed outcomes before taking action. They were trying to navigate an abstract world with concrete thinking tools, and they couldn't understand why they kept missing opportunities that seemed obvious to others. Here's where it gets personal, and I want you to really sit with this for a moment because this might be the most important thing you hear today. Think about the last time you faced a big decision, a relationship choice, a career move, a personal transformation you wanted to make. Did you find yourself paralyzed, unable to move forward because you couldn't see the exact outcome, because you couldn't guarantee the result, because it wasn't concrete enough? That's concrete operational thinking dominating your life. And while you're stuck demanding certainty, other people with formal operational thinking are moving forward based on patterns, principles, and probabilities. They're not smarter than you. They're not braver. They just have cognitive structures that allow them to act on abstract understanding. And you're sabotaging yourself by staying in the safety of concrete thinking because it feels more secure, even though it keeps you trapped in a life that's smaller than your potential. Now let me share something that might make you uncomfortable. but I need you to hear it because this could be the insight that changes everything. Leave a comment right now with this simple phrase, "I stayed stuck in concrete thinking." I know how this feels. You've been trying to figure this out alone, thinking that if you just gather enough information, enough evidence, enough certainty, then you'll finally be ready to move. But Piaget discovered that cognitive development doesn't happen through accumulation of information. It happens through disequilibrium, through moments when your current mental structures fail so completely that you're forced to build new ones. And reading these words, recognizing these patterns in yourself, that uncomfortable feeling in your chest right now, that's disequilibrium. That's your mind realizing its current structures aren't adequate. If this resonates with you, if you're seeing yourself in these patterns, leave that comment. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in this struggle. You have more power to help others than you realize, and by acknowledging your pattern publicly, even in this small way, you're taking the first step toward accommodation, toward actually changing the mental structure instead of just understanding it intellectually. The third way you're sabotaging yourself is through what Piaget called irreversibility in thinking. This is subtle but devastating. Irreversible thinking means you can follow a line of logic in one direction, but you can't mentally reverse it to see it from the other side. Children in the pre-operational stage show this clearly. You show them two identical glasses of water, then pour one into a tall, thin glass and one into a short, wide glass. They'll tell you the tall glass has more water because they can't mentally reverse the operation of pouring to see they're the same amount. Adults do this constantly in relationships and career. Someone hurts you, and you can follow that logic forward. They hurt me, therefore they're bad, therefore I should protect myself, therefore I should distance myself. But you can't reverse that operation to consider, maybe I hurt them first, or maybe what I interpreted as hurt was actually something else, or maybe there's a cycle here where we're both reacting to reactions. You get stuck in linear thinking, cause and effect in one direction only, and you can't see the circular causality that's actually operating. Piaget documented a case in the 1960s of a woman who came to him after her third divorce. Highly intelligent, successful in her career, absolutely convinced that she kept choosing the wrong partners. But as Piaget worked with her, he discovered she had completely irreversible thinking about relationships. She could tell you in detail everything her partners did wrong, every hurt, every disappointment. But she literally could not reverse the cognitive operation to see how her reactions to those initial hurts created new hurts, which triggered new reactions, creating a cycle. She experienced relationships as linear. He did this, which caused that, which caused this outcome. She couldn't see the circular system where her behavior was also cause, not just effect. The fourth pattern of self-sabotage is what Piaget identified as the inability to conserve in adult thinking. In child development, conservation is understanding that properties remain the same even when appearance changes. The water in different shaped glasses is still the same amount. The same number of coins spread out or bunched together is still the same number. Children develop this around age 7. But Piaget found that adults lose this capacity when under stress or in unfamiliar domains. And this is where you sabotage yourself brutally. Someone gives you the same feedback in a gentle, kind tone. You receive it as helpful. The same exact feedback in a frustrated tone. You receive it as an attack. The content is identical. The container changed, but you can't conserve the actual message. You react to the packaging, not the substance. Or think about your own worth. When things are going well, you feel valuable. When things are difficult, you feel worthless. But your actual value, your skills, your character, your potential, these haven't changed. Only the external circumstances changed. But you can't conserve your sense of self through changing conditions. This creates a life where you're constantly reactive, where your identity shifts based on the last conversation you had, the last outcome you experienced, the last person's opinion you heard. You have no stable center because you never developed the cognitive ability to conserve who you are through changing conditions. Piaget studied artists and found this pattern repeatedly. Talented people who would create something brilliant, receive one piece of criticism and completely fall apart, quit, destroy their work. They couldn't conserve their ability through changing feedback. The ability was constant, The reception varied, but they experienced each piece of feedback as redefining their entire worth and capacity. The fifth sabotage pattern is the failure to develop what Piaget called operational thinking about time and causality. Most adults think about time in an infantile way without realizing it. They experience cause and effect as immediate and linear. I do this action, I get that result, right now. But complex outcomes in adult life work through layered causality across extended time. You invest in a relationship today, it pays dividends 5 years from now in ways you can't predict. You develop a skill now, it opens an opportunity 7 years later through connections you haven't met yet. You make a health choice today, it prevents or causes outcomes decades in the future. But if you're stuck in concrete operational thinking about time, you need immediate results. You try something for 3 weeks, don't see dramatic change, conclude it doesn't work. You invest in a relationship for a few months, don't feel perfect connection, decide it's not right. You're applying childhood thinking about time and causality to adult situations that require formal operational understanding of complex systems unfolding over years. Piaget documented cases of highly intelligent people who destroyed their lives through this temporal thinking error. A man who changed careers every 18 months because he didn't see fast enough progress, never understanding that mastery and opportunity in any field require years of compound development. A woman who left relationships the moment they required work, chasing the initial spark feeling, not understanding that deep intimacy is built through years of accumulated trust and shared experience. They weren't impulsive or flighty, they had sophisticated justifications for every decision. But underneath the rationalizations was a cognitive structure that couldn't operate with adult concepts of time and causality. The sixth way you sabotage yourself is through what Piaget called the symbolic function gone wrong. Symbols are powerful. They let us think about things that aren't present, plan for the future, learn from the past. But the symbolic function can create a devastating trap. You start living more in your symbolic representation of reality than in reality itself. You have a mental image of who you should be, and you judge your actual self against that symbol constantly. You have a symbolic representation of what a good relationship looks like, and you reject real relationships because they don't match the symbol. You have a symbolic idea of success, and you feel like a failure even when you're actually progressing, because your reality doesn't match your symbol. Piaget observed that this symbolic tyranny was one of the main sources of human suffering. People torturing themselves not because their actual lives were bad, but because their lives didn't match the symbolic ideals they'd constructed. And here's the trap. The more intelligent you are, the more elaborate and detailed your symbols can be, and therefore the more ways your reality can fail to measure up. Piaget documented a particularly heartbreaking case in the 1970s. A man who was a devoted father, present, loving, engaged with his children. But he was miserable because his symbolic representation of the perfect father, based on impossible standards from media and his own idealization, meant he experienced himself as constantly failing. His actual children were happy and thriving. But he lived in torture because he was comparing his reality to a symbol that no human could ever match. The symbol, which should have been a helpful guide, became a prison, and this man couldn't see that the problem wasn't his parenting. It was his inability to recognize the symbol as a symbol, rather than as the standard of reality. The seventh and most profound pattern of self-sabotage Piaget identified is the failure to achieve what he called reflective abstraction. This is the ability to think about your own thinking, to observe your own mental processes, to recognize your schemas as schemas rather than as reality itself. This is the ultimate cognitive development, and it's rare. Most people go through their entire lives completely identified with their thoughts, believing that the way they think is just the way things are. They can't step back and observe that they're operating through schemas, that their mind is constructing reality through particular structures that could be different. Without reflective abstraction, you're trapped. You can learn new information, but you can't change how you process information. You can try to change your behaviors, but you can't change the thinking that generates those behaviors. You're imprisoned in your own cognitive structures without even knowing there's a prison, because you think the bars are the actual architecture of reality. Piaget spent the last 2 decades of his life studying people who had achieved reflective abstraction, and he found something remarkable. These people had often gone through intense crisis, profound failure, experiences that shattered their existing schemas so completely that they had no choice but to observe the schemas themselves rather than just looking through them. A business failure that destroyed someone's identity as successful, forcing them to examine who they were beyond achievement. A betrayal so profound it shattered someone's entire understanding of relationships, forcing them to build completely new ways of understanding trust and connection. A health crisis that demolished someone's sense of control, forcing them to develop entirely different cognitive structures around security and meaning. The crisis itself wasn't the gift, it was the opportunity. Most people go through crisis and just rebuild the same structures, stronger walls around the same limited schemas. But some people, often with guidance, use the crisis to achieve reflective abstraction, to step back and see their own thinking as an object they can examine and change. Now I want you to think about something specific. One of these 7 patterns probably hit harder than the others. One of them made you uncomfortable, made you defensive, made you want to explain why your situation is different. That's the one. That's the schema that's running your life right now, and that's the one that's creating the most sabotage. And here's what Piaget would tell you. You can't think your way out of a cognitive structure limitation using that same cognitive structure. You can't solve assimilation problems with more assimilation. You need accommodation. You need to actually change the structure. And that requires what Piaget called equilibration, the process of recognizing disequilibrium, the discomfort when your schemas don't work, and using that discomfort as the signal to build new structures rather than just defending the old ones. This is precisely what's happening for you right now. If you're feeling uncomfortable, if these patterns are resonating, your mind is in disequilibrium. You have a choice right now. You can assimilate this information, which means you'll intellectually understand these 7 patterns, maybe even recognize them in other people, but you'll find sophisticated reasons why they don't really apply to you, or why your situation is special, or why you'll work on them later. That's your mind protecting its existing structures. Or you can move toward accommodation, which means you actually sit with the discomfort, you examine the specific schema that's limiting you, and you commit to the hard work of building new cognitive structures that serve your growth instead of your ego. Let me tell you what happened to that engineer I mentioned at the beginning, the one trapped in egocentric thinking. Piaget worked with him for almost 2 years. The breakthrough came when the engineer had an experience that created such profound disequilibrium his schemas couldn't assimilate it. He was working on a complex project, absolutely convinced his approach was correct. A junior colleague, someone he'd dismissed as inexperienced, suggested a completely different approach. The engineer ignored it, moved forward with his design, and the project failed catastrophically. But the junior colleague had documented their alternative approach, and when another firm implemented something similar, it succeeded brilliantly. The engineer couldn't assimilate this. His schema that he was the expert and others were wrong couldn't accommodate the reality that a junior person had seen something he missed. He had 2 options: have a complete breakdown and quit the field, or develop new cognitive structures. With Piaget's guidance, he chose the latter. He began the painful process of developing decentration, of learning to genuinely consider that other perspectives might have validity, that his view was a view, not the view. It took 2 more years of consistent practice. He had to learn to pause when he felt that familiar defensiveness, to recognize it as a signal that his egocentric schema was being challenged, and to consciously choose to consider the other perspective before responding. He had to build entirely new neural pathways for processing disagreement, and slowly, his life transformed. He maintained his next job for 5 years, built genuine collaborative relationships, eventually became known as one of the best team leaders in his company. Not because his technical skills improved, but because his cognitive structures evolved. That transformation is available to you, but you need to understand what Piaget made absolutely clear. Cognitive development in adults doesn't happen through reading or understanding intellectually. It happens through action, through practice, through repeatedly choosing to operate from new schemas even when the old ones feel more comfortable. You know the pattern that's sabotaging you most. You felt it earlier in this message. Now you have to do the work. When you notice yourself doing assimilation without accommodation, forcing new experiences into old categories, pause. Literally stop. Ask yourself, what would I have to believe differently to see this situation another way? Write down the alternative perspective even if you don't believe it yet. That's practicing accommodation. When you catch yourself in concrete operational thinking, demanding certainty before action, pause. Ask yourself, what pattern or principle can I see here, even without concrete proof? What would I do if I trusted my formal operational thinking? Take one small action based on abstract understanding rather than concrete certainty. That's building new cognitive structures. When you recognize irreversible thinking, seeing cause and effect in only one direction, pause. Deliberately reverse the operation. If you think they hurt me, therefore I responded this way, reverse it. How did I hurt them? How might my response have been the cause, not just the effect? Map out the circular causality. That's developing cognitive reversibility. When you lose conservation, when your sense of self or others shifts completely based on changing conditions, pause. Write down what remains constant, regardless of the changing container. Your skills exist even when outcomes vary. Someone's character remains even when their mood changes. Your worth is constant even when circumstances fluctuate. That's practicing conservation. When you fall into infantile time thinking, wanting immediate results from complex long-term processes, pause. Map out the actual timeline of causality in this domain. How long does mastery really take? How do the actions you take today create outcomes years from now? Adjust your expectations and commitments based on realistic time horizons. That's developing operational thinking about time. When you torture yourself because reality doesn't match your symbolic ideals, pause. Recognize the symbol as a symbol. Ask yourself, is this standard realistic for any human being, or have I created an impossible symbol? What would be a wise guide versus a tyrannical ideal? That's managing the symbolic function consciously. And when you want to develop reflective abstraction, the ability to observe your own thinking, establish a practice. Every evening, spend 10 minutes reviewing your day, not for what happened, but for how you thought about what happened. What schemas were you operating from? Where did you assimilate when you should have accommodated? Where did your cognitive structures limit what you could see or do? This is building the observer position, the ability to see your thinking as an object, rather than being identified with it. Piaget's final insight, the one that gives me most hope for you, is that cognitive development has no age limit. Unlike physical development, which has biological constraints, cognitive structures can continue evolving as long as you live. He documented people in their 60s and 70s achieving levels of cognitive sophistication they'd never reached in their youth. The barrier isn't age or intelligence, it's willingness to enter disequilibrium, to let your current schemas be challenged, to do the uncomfortable work of accommodation rather than the comfortable work of assimilation. You're here, reading these words, recognizing patterns. That means your mind is ready for this growth. The disequilibrium you feel isn't a sign something is wrong with you. It's a sign something is finally right. It's your cognitive structures stretching, preparing to evolve. You've sabotaged yourself 7 times, maybe 700 times, through lack of awareness. But awareness isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you build, structure by structure, schema by schema, day by day. And every time you catch yourself operating from a limiting cognitive structure and consciously choose to build a new one, you're not just changing your thinking. You're changing the architecture of what you can perceive, what you can do, who you can become. You're standing at the threshold of genuine transformation, not the temporary motivation kind that fades in a week. The structural kind, the kind that changes how your mind constructs reality. Piaget proved it's possible. He documented the exact process. Now the only question is whether you'll use this discomfort you're feeling right now as fuel for growth, or whether you'll find a sophisticated way to assimilate this information into your existing structures and continue the same patterns. I believe you're ready for the real work. And when you continue this journey with us, exploring how to actually implement these cognitive transformations in specific areas of your life, You're not just learning more psychology, you're actively rebuilding the operating system of your mind. This channel exists to guide that process, to show you case after case from Piaget and other pioneers of human development, to give you the specific practices that turn intellectual understanding into structural transformation. Join us in this discovery, this continuous evolution of consciousness. Click that subscribe button not just to get more content, but to commit to your own cognitive development, to the person you're becoming through this work. And know that every video, every insight, every moment of disequilibrium you embrace is building new structures that expand what's possible for your life. Next, we explore how Piaget's concept of the ideal self versus the real self creates the specific pattern of self-rejection that keeps you from accessing your greatest strengths. How the schemas you built about who you should be are actively preventing you from becoming who you can be. That's a journey into the heart of your potential, and I'll see you there.